All right, so let's get started. To tell the story of Thomas Knight, let's begin with his grandfather, Mills Olcott Burnham. Born September 8th, 1817 in Vermont, he grew up in Troy, New York, training as a gunsmith. At age 18, he married Mary McEwen, 2 years his junior, who as a child had emigrated from Ireland. 3 years into their marriage, Mills's health took a turn for the worse. In those days, people who were ill in the north, especially with respiratory issues, were told to go south to recover. So he did in 1837. His family remained behind while he recovered. Not only did his health improve, but his renowned strength returned as well. He liked the climate so much that in 1839 he moved his family, which now included 2 children, down to Jacksonville. Due to his strength and prowess with firearms, he was convinced to become the town's first sheriff. By 1841, he was even elected to the territorial legislature. The next year, the family moved to the Indian River, where Burnham grew citrus and was reported to be the first to grow pineapples commercially for the first time in the state. When Mills first built his home, he easily befriended the natives. They too were impressed with his incredible strength and gunsmithing abilities, quickly earning their respect. The natives would often come by to visit and trade with him, and while he enjoyed their visits, they terrified Mary, but they were always respectful and never caused the family any harm. Finding it tough to make ends meet, though, he soon bought a schooner, named her the Josephine, and used it to haul green turtles to Charleston, which were then shipped to England. Unlike others doing this at the time, he actually took care of the turtles while in transit, giving them wooden pillows to rest their heads on and cleaning their eyes every morning with salt water. Before Mills left on his travels, he would alert the natives, though, of his impending departure, and out of respect, they didn't come around and bother his wife. And life was good in the small community until 1849. Burnham had taken a shipment of turtles up north and, as usual, made a stop on his return in St. Augustine. Shockingly, he found his entire family there, along with everyone else from his community. The natives had killed a local trader, a man named Barker, who had been ripping them off by putting black sand in the gunpowder and water in the whiskey that he had swapped with them. Barker's brother, thinking he was next to be killed, alerted everyone and they fled to the city in their boats, but not before one of the natives shot him in the arm. Stumbling below deck, in the dark, the wounded man grabbed a bottle he thought was medicine, covered his arm in it, and bandaged it up. When he arrived in St. Augustine, the bandages were removed, revealing that his entire arm had turned black. Terrified, he immediately ran to the doctor demanding an instant amputation. Despite a thorough exam and reassurances by the doctor that the injured man wouldn't relent, fearing that gangrene was going to kill him. So, finally, after much debate, the doctor acquiesced to the demands of the man and cut off his arm. And it was discovered a little too late that what he thought was medicine was actually a bottle of black ink. And apparently, everyone on his crew knew it was black ink, but he was so hated that nobody actually spoke up and actually wanted to see him cut his arm off. In 1850, the Cape Canaveral lighthouse keeper, Nathaniel Scobie, resigned after only 2 years in the existence of the lighthouse. His replacement, Orr Carpenter, shortly after his arrival, had warned his boss, Stephen Pleasanton, that the original brick lighthouse needed a lot of help. Excessive amounts of sand had eroded from the base of the lighthouse, and it was becoming unsafe. So he and Pleasanton were at odds with each other almost from the start, and whether he was fired, transferred, or quit is really unknown at this time. And by sheer luck, Burnham had returned to the area in 1853, and being one of the few to have done so after the attack on Barker. Despite having no experience in the lighthouse business, Burnham was named the lighthouse keeper at Cape Canaveral, basically because there was nobody else around to do the job. By this time, the Burnhams had 2 sons and 4 daughters. George was the first to be born, was also the first to die at roughly age 14. Daughter Frances came next. Mills Jr., their 3rd child, would die fighting in the Civil War for the Confederacy. Mills Sr., though, his allegiance remained to the North Lighthouse Society or service. Next born in the family were Louisa, Mary, and Jerusha Catherine. Another daughter, Anna, would come while living at the lighthouse. As I just stated, Mills remained loyal to his position during the war. Construction of the replacement lighthouse was halted as workers all fled. The Confederacy wanted all the lighthouses extinguished because they only aided the North. Mills feared that the soldiers were going to come and destroy the illumination device to ensure that it remained dark. To prevent this, he dismantled it, packed it in crates, and hid it in various spots around his citrus orchard. When the war ended, he quickly put it back together, which greatly pleased the Lighthouse board. For his actions, he was retained as the keeper. Now, with the war over and no sons to carry on his name, it's easy to think that his legacy would come to an end when he passed away. However, the Lighthouse service is something of its own animal. They place lights where necessary, often in dangerous or remote places. With no one else miles around in any direction, it's really no wonder that so many lighthouse families intermarried. And in this case, it was the daughters of their families that carried on the family business. In the early 1850s, Burnham's oldest daughter, Frances, became his assistant out of necessity. Stephen Pleasanton, who was in charge of the lighthouse service, was a penny-pinching accountant who'd never worked in the marine industry. While his excessive thrift saved the government financially, the low pay and poor quality of the lights came to the detriment of the keepers, sailors, and companies that insured the ships. Since Frances wasn't an official hire, she never received any pay for any of her efforts. However, that never stopped her from performing her duties. She would marry Henry Wilson, a 23-year-old corporal in the United States Army who was part of a detachment sent to protect the lighthouse and the keepers from the natives as the Seminole Wars were a constant threat. Upon their wedding, the red-headed, bushy-bearded Wilson took over first assistant duties for about the next 4 years. It was an official appointment, so he actually did get paid for his work. Daughter Louisa, who went by Lucy, married a man named Charles Nauman. One of their sons, George Burnham Nauman, joined the family business. He would serve at Jupiter, Ponce Inlet, then known as Mosquito Inlet, St. Simons, and in 1910 came to Hillsborough as a first assistant, beating his own cousin there by a year. Nauman would sadly fall under the spell of the deranged second assistant, Willie Sherritt, and both even threatened the life of the keeper, Alfred Burgell, but that's a story for another day. Daughters Jerusha, who went by Catherine for obvious reasons, and Anna would marry into the Quarterman family. Anna married George, who started as a second assistant in 1876, and within the same calendar year was promoted to first assistant. When Mills died on April 17, 1886 from a measles outbreak, George took over as keeper, and their son Oscar would join the service as well. So this leaves Mary Burnham. The man who caught her eye was a man named James Monroe Knight, born in 1860. He started as a second assistant at the Cape in 1880, and from 1886 to 1887, he was a first assistant, then took over as keeper until 1893. The pair had married on July 19, 1877, and depending on whose family chart you follow on either Ancestry or MyHeritage.com, they had anywhere from 2 to 9 children, so we're really not sure. So we're just going to focus on 2 of those. On December 7th, 1871, they welcomed son Eugene Theodore Knight, better known in these parts simply as Cap. Then on November 13th, 1879, came Thomas. Thomas may or may not have had a middle name because, once again, depending on whose family tree you climb up, there are any number of different choices in combinations of initials or lack thereof. Cap's life story came from him, meaning it may or may not be, let's say, entirely accurate. He stated that at 13, he ran away from home to become a mess boy on a lighthouse tender. These were the ships operated by the United States Lighthouse Establishment out of the various depots in different states. He stated that he worked his way up the seafaring ladder on steamships that went from New York to New Orleans, eventually becoming a master on the Morgan Line. While he was doing that, Thomas followed in his father's, uncle's, cousins, grandfather's footsteps. He passed the required civil service exam on and became the second assistant on a probationary basis. He took his first oath of office in April 1902. Interestingly enough, on his personnel information sheet, he listed that prior to taking this exam, he followed the painting trade. And it's kind of ironic because he wound up painting the lighthouse pretty much every year of his tenure. Now, we're unsure when he met or married Fanny Gray, since we can't find the marriage certificate anywhere. Fanny's father, Seward Gray, pictured here holding his granddaughter Mary. By the time this picture was taken, was at Hillsborough. He had taken a second wife, also named Mary, who's standing by his side there. Now, for the Knights, their first son came in 1903. His name was Burnham Gray Knight. He was actually born at Cape Canaveral when he was a second assistant. The following year, Thomas was promoted to first assistant, which brought a slight increase in pay, which is good because the following year, their second son, Ellis Moore, was born. Their third son, Chauncey Richard, who went by Dick, joined the family in 1908. and the lone daughter, Mary Ella, rounded out the family in 1910. But before she was born in 1909, a simple incident could have changed the course of South Florida's history. As Fanny and her sisters-in-law were entertaining a guest, Thomas had stepped on a 6-foot rattlesnake, but fortunately, the poisonous serpent didn't bite him. Remember, this was 1909, and there wasn't a doctor anywhere near the Cape at the time. So had Thomas been bit, the likelihood of him surviving was really quite small. Fortunately, he wasn't bitten, so in 1911, when Alfred Burgell, who was fed up with the new district inspector, resigned from the service, it opened up the position at Hillsborough. Knight jumped at the opportunity to become a head keeper. He applied for and was awarded the promotion. Now recall that his cousin, George Nauman, was already the first assistant there, and although he was under official reprimand for his actions on him, he'd already begun to improve his name and his character. On a rainy July 29th in 1911, Thomas arrived in Fort Lauderdale, where he was met by the retiring keeper. For the next 3 days, Burgell instructed and tested the newcomer on how everything at the station worked, especially the lens and the clockwork mechanism, which gave him a lot of problems in the first few years. They also took a trip to Pompano, where he was shown where the general store was and where the post office was, because there was no such thing as home delivery yet, so all correspondence had to be taken to and picked up in Pompano. Knight took over as a keeper at Hillsborough on August 1st. His furniture arrived the next day on the 2nd, but his family didn't arrive until the 11th, so it really wasn't a big deal. He had everything set up and ready to go. But the rest of the year was really uneventful. The family settled into the routine of the new station, and the kids were soon out playing around in the wilderness, so it completely surrounded the lighthouse at the time. The following year, though, Knight would repeat the work of his predecessor. The inlet had closed up once again, so the 3 keepers took their shovels and dug a trench from south to north. This allowed the tides to reopen the entrance, something that was vital for him to be able to utilize his station boat. Otherwise, he'd have to go all the way up to Boca in order to access the ocean. And it didn't take long for the water to push enough sand out to open the channel up to pass through again. In 1912, the Bureau of Lighthouses introduced something new. They were called efficiency stars. They were meant as a way to reward the keepers for a clean, well-run station, and they were successful in creating healthy competition between the keepers of the different lighthouses, which in turn helped the stations be even better maintained than before. Knight and his crew were awarded their first accolades in October of that year for a clean, well-run, efficient station. Each received an official letter for their personnel file, and Knight was awarded a red ring lapel pin, which he was able to wear for an entire year. The station was sent an efficiency pennant to fly from their flagpole, also a source of pride for the keepers, because all the ship captains who passed by knew exactly what that flag meant. When Knight received 3 consecutive stars, he was actually awarded a blue version of the pin. Needless to say, Knight would spend many years wearing those pins. In the early days, there weren't very many options for entertainment, and the lighthouse provided to be a very popular attraction, as it was viewed as a technological marvel. So people flocked to the station to spend the day picnicking, swimming, fishing, and clamming. According to the Lighthouse Service, the keepers had to be welcoming to the public, answer all their questions, and really just promote the Lighthouse Service and give tours throughout the day, as long as it didn't interfere with their duties. When they did interfere with the duties, well, enter the wives and children to take up the slack. While it may have been a distraction, actually a lot of the wives welcomed the visitors to catch up on local gossip and other events of the day. When the children got older, they were given the duties of climbing the lighthouse with the guests and even explain how the light worked. While Burgell didn't log the number of visitors, for a while Knight did. Some days it could be as low as 15, and others could be over 150. Holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's were also really popular dates that the keepers had to play host, whether they wanted to or not. Knight had already helped a couple of boaters with minor difficulties, but his first major incident of his tenure came on April 15th, 1913, when the schooner Alice Holbrook ran on an unmarked sunken wreck of a British steamer 4 miles south of the lighthouse. Her bow was torn open and she filled with water in about 20 minutes. Knight and Nauman tried to help, but the seas were just too rough. So later that night, when it calmed a bit, Knight went out and towed their lifeboat to the station. The keepers fed and put up the crew in the cottages for the next 5 days. Knight helped save the sails and other bits, but the rough weather took the ship to pieces before real salvage work could be done. But for his work, Knight received the first of many commendations from the Lighthouse Service. He would actually go on to earn enough efficiency stars and so many commendations that Josh Liller, the historian for Jupiter, actually dubbed him the Tom Brady of lighthouse keepers because he won the most. Another ship that came in distress in 1913 was called the Francis Hyde. She was carrying a load of cement bound for Tampa when it ran aground. Knight and his assistants immediately went to help and tried to refloat the ship, and to do it, a large amount of the cargo had to be thrown overboard, but eventually she was freed and on her way. Now, in May 1914, Fanny Knight became severely ill. Both her and Thomas would take turns coming down with severe illnesses during their lives. Some of them kept them under bed rest for quite some time. And on this particular occasion, Knight wrote, Keeper went to Pompano for physician. Keeper's wife very sick, 30 visitors. Note that he stated he went for the doctor, but didn't take him back. Well, that's because she was so sick that the doctor actually stayed the night, and Thomas would have to retrieve the doctor a few more times during the week before she was well enough to not need assistance anymore. What few doctors there were at the time actually travel around the area, so in future incidents, they would have to go either to Deerfield, Delray, or Fort Lauderdale to find the doctor. And there were no roads, so he had to rely on the station boat in order to travel around. The following year, as war raged in Europe and the Lusitania was sunk, lighthouse keepers were suddenly instructed to watch for German U-boats. Knight often noted in the log the signal flags from passing ships, but they weren't always readable. If he could get a message from a ship that needed to be relayed, it was his responsibility to take that to appropriate authority, which would mean a trip to either Pompano or Fort Lauderdale to relay the message. Fortunately, this rarely happened, but if Thomas did travel, more than likely, Burnham joined him. Burnham loved their boat and learned to handle her at a really early age. He loved fishing with his dad, showing a natural ability at the sport. The amount and variety of the fish in the area made it perfect training grounds for the kid, too. Not surprisingly, in 1912, Burnham had a glimpse of his future charter fishing career. His first job took him in his little rowboat along with 3 fishermen out for a day's catch. Over the next few years, he was guiding more and more, and by 1915, he had a boat for hire. But being not even 13 years old, his father would accompany him on all the trips. As his skills progressed, Burnham would accompany his father on some of his own rescues, and in 1920 made a solo rescue of a man who was drowning in heavy surf. Then in 1924, the Lighthouse tender Cyprus anchored off the lighthouse. Fearing a hurricane was coming off of Cuba, they wanted to get to Miami as quickly as possible, and although no written details remain as to why they needed assistance, surprisingly, it was Burnham who guided the ship all the way down to Miami. 1916 saw the departure of Knight's cousin Nauman, who was reassigned to Mosquito Inlet. His replacement, John Henry Mings, wasn't the only newcomer to the area. Cap Knight had retired from a life at sea and was making a living running a fishing camp when he met Lola Saunders, a teacher that in 2 years would be his second wife. While we don't know where she taught, we do know that her pupils included the children of local fishermen and those from the lighthouse. Lola was 23 and Cap was 43 when they wed. Now, Cap had been married to Bertha Lydia Armour, the daughter of a lighthouse keeper up in Jupiter. And no, that isn't her on the left. The marriage produced 3 children, but ultimately she wasn't happy. Bertha eventually asked him for a divorce, but he was really reluctant. And in a twist of fate, Bertha found herself with an ace up her sleeve. Her lawyer was also representing Warren Alligator Joe Frazee in his own divorce. Frazee desperately wanted to be rid of his wife and somehow talked Cap into falsely testifying under oath that they were having an affair. So the judge ruled for Joe, and Bertha's attorney used Cap's false testimony against him. Needless to say, it too was granted. And although the pair divorced, Bertha always was there for him when he needed help, probably much to Lola's displeasure. If you can guess from the picture of her, she wasn't really a fun-loving type of person. Fanny would fall severely ill again 2 more times in 1916, requiring more doctors to come to the station. At times she was so ill that Thomas traded out his turn standing watch at night in order to be at his wife's side. Come December, though, she was healthy when Knight, Mings, and new second assistant William McCreary went to an overturned boat. 2 ladies and 1 man were desperately clinging to the hull of the boat as the rescue party arrived. Everyone was saved, as was the boat, and were brought to the station. Fanny once again provided dry clothes and a warm meal for everyone. Thomas took them afterwards to Fort Lauderdale, and while the 3 keepers received official commendations for the life-saving efforts, Fanny received their enduring gratitude from the trio for life. Shortly thereafter, the barkentine Hildegard got stuck on the reef. Once again, Knight was off to see if help was needed. The crew was tossing part of their load of lumber overboard to lighten their weight, and the captain didn't ask for any help in lightening the ship this time, but instead he had a different request. He had an urgent telegram that needed to be sent, so Knight took it and immediately went to Fort Lauderdale and sent it off. And he didn't receive an official commendation for that, but he was highly praised for doing an unselfish act from his supervisors. As the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the station was closed to all visitors, something the locals were extremely unhappy with, and to make life more remote for the keepers' wives as well. To stay connected, though, Fanny and the other wives would go to either Pompano or Deerfield for supplies, mail, and just basic chit-chat with friends. To get there, often they trusted Burnham to safely pilot their boat there. One day, a 40-foot motorboat came on the rocks on the north point of the inlet. Knight and new first assistant Clarence Malloy went out in rough seas to help. It took him about an hour to get the boat off the reef and into the inlet. Knight then overhauled the engine before setting them on their way. The boaters claimed to be painters that were on their way to Miami. And in Knight's closing statement to his supervisor, he noted, "I would further add that the men on board the motorboat were completely unaccustomed to boating and did not know bow from stern, and they were very incapable of handling a boat." Seems like some things just never seem to change around here. Later that year, schooner was at anchor in heavy seas 2 miles north of the station, so off Knight went with the help of 4 friends from the fishing camp across the inlet to see what was the matter. The schooner was Miami bound when it hit a hurricane off of Cape Canaveral. The damaged ship was leaking badly and the engine had been broken down. The sails had lost most of its running rigging, making controlled travel darn near impossible. And to make matters worse, the crew were out of water and supplies. So using what they had, Knight got the rigging working well enough to have control, but before they left, he supplied them with the necessary water and supplies to make it to Miami. In 1918, signalmen were sent to teach the keepers how to perform the art of semaphore and light signaling in Morse code. Since the ships didn't have radio technology yet, they would be able to message the keepers about submarines or other dangers they saw. And the keepers would be able to converse with the new class of ships called the sub-chasers. These were fast, highly maneuverable boats that were able to close in on a submarine and drop depth charges on them. So after intensive training, all 3 keepers were taking day-long shifts at the top of the lighthouse on the observation deck. And since 2 keepers worked every night, the one who wasn't on watch was positioned on the deck with the flags and a lantern. 1918 also saw something that would become something of an epidemic. Knight had to write a formal letter to the district inspector for any assistance given, detailing names, dates, times, actions taken, and the like. So he wrote, "On Thursday p.m., June 13, about 3 o'clock, I sighted a hydro airplane drifting at sea about 5 miles east-southeast of the station. I went out to her in the launch, but by the time I reached her, she was about northeast of the station, having drifted about 4 miles. I learned on reaching her that she was a government plane from the aerial station in Miami, Florida. There were 3 men aboard. She had been drifting about 4 hours with a disabled motor. I took her in tow and towed her about 3 miles against quite a heavy, choppy sea and fresh south-southeast wind and heavy rain squalls. I met the sub-chaser number 156 and she took the plane in tow and left for Miami." Now, aviation was in its infancy, and pretty much anyone who could afford to buy a plane and wanted to, did. The problem they discovered, just like in the early days of automobiles, is they didn't have a fuel gauge. Unlike cars who would just stop on the side of the road, airplanes had a little bit different problem. And quite literally, the planes would soon be dropping out of the sky. Fortunately for this area, most of them were seaplanes and they made a safe landing. But not all had a happy ending, though. Knight received more commendations for his efforts, but there would come a time that Knight was sending his boss so many letters about airplanes that he was giving assistance to that his boss refused to award him any further commendations unless under extreme hazardous conditions. The awards didn't really mean that much to him, so it didn't stop him from helping. So he continued on, and when he couldn't, he would even send his brother Cap out to do it. In 1919, an opportunity came up that Knight just couldn't turn down. When the keeper of the Jupiter Lighthouse resigned, Thomas and Fanny saw it as an opportunity for their kids to receive a better education in the more established area of Jupiter. Knight put in for a transfer and was awarded the position. Replacing him was the first assistant at Tybee Island Lighthouse Station. His name was Charles Seabrook, and this was the first opportunity for him to be a head keeper. He arrived with a large family, which actually would come into play sooner than you'd think. The Knights had left at the end of April, but it didn't take them long to regret that decision. By September, Thomas took a little trip and returned to Hillsborough to discuss the possibility of the two making a swap. So Seabrook accompanied him. They went up to Jupiter. He too liked the area, along with the educational possibilities for his kids, and they agreed. And apparently the district didn't mind the swap, so on the 15th of October, each family was at their new station. This would actually be the final transfers for both men, and they spent the rest of their long careers at their respective lighthouses. Now, 1920 saw more visitors, more boats in distress, and yes, more airplanes literally falling out of the sky. The first one of the year sadly resulted in a tragic consequence for the three men aboard. This was also the beginning of the Prohibition era across the land, and keepers were now duly bound to report suspicious activity to the Coast Guard. The installation of a telephone in the watch of the room of the lighthouse towards the end of the war made that communication much easier for him. In March, Knight went to see why a skiff had been abandoned aground on a sandbar. When he got there, he discovered it was loaded with illegal booze, which he promptly towed in and turned over to the revenuers. Later that month, another boat came to the station, this time with one man in custody. One man was piloting the vessel, and one man who had a severely chewed up finger. Earlier, the rum runner tried to jump overboard, and as the officer followed with him, his finger unfortunately wound up in the man's mouth. Seizing upon the opportunity, literally, he bit down, and he bit down hard. But he mangled the guy's finger, but he failed to escape. So seeing the lighthouse, they stopped at the station for medical attention, which Knight, of course, gave. Meanwhile, as Cap was doing this, as Thomas was doing this, Cap and Lola had moved up to Manalapan. He began a fishing business and overhauled a 26-foot skiff, furnishing it with a Buick automobile engine. And the horsepower wasn't used to run down the big fish, but rather to evade the authorities. Nothing the Coast Guard or revenuers had now could catch him, so he began his career as a rum runner too. And while Thomas was out in heavy seas helping distressed revenuers, Cap was freely breezing back and forth to Bimini, always loaded with liquor. But that wasn't the only thing that happened at the station in 1920. Remember, the Knights had moved to get their kids a better chance for an education, and that idea didn't vanish when they returned. Actually, the idea probably came to them while they were in Jupiter, prompting them to move back. See, each keeper was furnished with a cottage and a storehouse. Thomas converted the bulk of his storehouse into a one-room schoolhouse. He built the desks, the benches, and even added a window to add more light. And the state had to provide a teacher if there were 9 children there. And with the kids from the fishing camp across the inlet, they had their magic number. So Thomas went to the superintendent of public instruction in Fort Lauderdale and requested that a teacher be sent. And incidentally, on the 19th of May, the first teacher arrived, and the school opened the following day. Her name was Emma Hoff, and she lived with the Knights for the entirety of the school term before going on to her next assignment, as each successive teacher would do as well. And the school lasted until 1925, when the swing bridge over the inlet was built. Then the kids of the area went to Pompano for the remainder of their education, all becoming bean pickers. Okay, now the next story is my absolute favorite, so bear with me here. Wildfires in the dry season were always a threat from the very first days, with notations in the logbook about them. Occasionally, the smoke-filled air made breathing difficult for everyone at the station. Now, on the morning of May 7th, 1921, a fire had already been burning for a few days. Now, normally these were out in the Everglades, but this one was completely different. Knight and his second assistant, Judge Eisler, took the station boat up to Deerfield for supplies and to scout out the danger. Wind was pushing the fire south down the peninsula, and there was nothing in the way to stop it. Rather, just the opposite. It was a long strip of dry vegetation in a straight line headed right towards the station. Hurrying back, the two grabbed shovels, picks, and axes. They chose a strategic location on the mile to go to work, and by rule, one keeper had to remain on the station no matter what. So as the two men got to work, Guthrie Phelps, the first assistant, remained behind and prepared for the worst. The two men then cut down all the vegetation in a 10-foot wide strip from canal to beach. They then dug the area down about a foot or two, leaving only sand behind. When they got this done, they lighted a backfire on the north side of the work site in an attempt to eliminate all the fuel and anything that might float over in the winds and land on the south side and start the fire again. Exhausted, the men delighted when the fire reached the edge of their backburn and just died out because there's no remaining fuel. The station had been saved, and remarkably, all this was done in a single day. And once again, they received commendations for their efforts. In December of that year, Thomas, Burnham and Phelps went to help a 16-foot boat named Hope that had swamped in heavy seas. The three people were saved, and Knight reported that the woman of the party nearly drowned. After receiving Knight's official report from the incident, District Inspector Beck reached out to the family. He received the following letter in which it states, "Beg to say that wife and I were out fishing in the ocean near Hillsborough Lighthouse on December 13. And when coming in at a bar, a groundswell wave came along and curled over and filled our boat with water. We had to go overboard in water about waist deep, and the lighthouse keeper came to our assistance and took Mrs. Willingham to his home, where his wife, Mrs. Knight, was most kind in giving her dry clothes, etc. I tried to show my hearty appreciation of Mr. Knight for his kindness by rewarding him in part for his services, but he positively refused, saying he did his duty and he did it well, and should, in my humble opinion, be commended." And he was. A few days later, the SS Folger ran aground. Thomas, Burnham, and Ellis, the other son, joined a Coast Guard vessel in getting this behemoth off the reef. Using the station boat as well as the ship's lifeboats, they towed the anchor chains out, dropped the anchors well away, and the ship's captain began to haul them in. As the anchors dug in, they grabbed, and the captain was able to use that in order to pull the ship off the reef. Now, in 1924, the first assistant, Clarence King, would resign and move to Fort Lauderdale and would join the fire department, eventually becoming chief. Thomas's son, Ellis, would later join the fire department and actually serve underneath him. But unfortunately, that's really all we know about Ellis's life and career. King's replacement, though, would have a profound effect on Knight's other son, Burnham. The new first assistant keeper was Ben Stone, who came with his wife, Annie Jane. Annie had hailed from Georgia, and upon learning of the storehouse school, went back to visit her family. When she returned, she wasn't alone. Her younger sister, Minnie May, had come to live with them and get an education. Minnie was born in 1909, making her almost 15 when she arrived. She was a fun-loving, laid-back girl with a southern drawl and would eventually catch the eye of Burnham, who was 5 years older than her. It's unknown when they fell in love, but when Stone resigned in 26, the family left the station for Pompano. Stone's job fell through, though, rather quickly, and they returned, but only temporarily before departing again until his return in 1937. And though they had left, Minnie stayed behind, most likely rooming with Mary, as the two had developed a great friendship. Burnham and Minnie would marry in 1927, just as his charter career was booming. Minnie even helped out in any way she could, often going on the trips, even acting as crew. Later in life, the pair would pilot private vessels from up north for their wealthy owners. The couple would have 3 children, Shirley, Billy, and Linda, pictured here with their mother. Burnham even named his charter boat after Shirley Jane, and that's his son Billy there with him.
Daddy!
Cap Knight would return to the area in either 1925 or 1926, opening a small business on the tip of a peninsula that used to be part of Wahoo Bay across the inlet from the lighthouse. Here he would sell supplies to local fishermen, cook up daily catches, and of course, sell booze. Lots and lots of booze. The bottles were tied in sacks and dropped into the bay in cleverly disguised markers that only Cap knew. When an order came in, he would take his boat out, pull up a bottle, and head back. This worked so well for him that he continued to practice over in Lake Placid after he moved. Now, local legend has it that Thomas would signal Cap from the top of the lighthouse when he was coming across with his legal booze to let him know that the coast was clear. But obviously no written confirmation was ever given from either brother, so again, it's just local legend. Cap would abandon that early site early on, about 2 years into it, because hurricanes told him that this site was really just too vulnerable. It was about this time he befriended and partnered up with Al Hassey. In typical Cap fashion, his first choice for a new location was actually on a sandbar that had formed in the inlet years earlier. Well, the state quickly stepped in and kicked him off. So the two purchased an old Flagler used barge down in Miami, which became the foundation for the soon-to-come Club Unique. A name that really only Cap liked. Everyone else just called it Cap's Place, and so the name stuck. And being family would head over every day to Cap's to help clean the fish for the meals. And even at times, Mary and Minnie would help out as well. 1926 brought more than one hurricane in the station. These were the first severe hurricanes to hit of the Knight tenure. Knight discovered just how much the tower could vibrate and sway in heavy winds, noting that some of the mercury that the lens rotated upon actually came out of the trough due to excessive sway of the tower. In the second hurricane, things were so bad that Cap, Lola, Al, and the new neighbors, the Malcolms, even sought refuge at the station, sheltering the cottages. Now, what you're looking at is the old Cape Fear station, and except for the height of the lighthouse, everything was the same. Same tower, same cottages, same storehouses, same oil house, same everything. See, they had learned a long time ago that certain style of cottages suited certain areas. And if you look off to the left there, you can see that the cottages sit on concrete block pilings about 3 feet above ground level. And this was for a very good reason. During the hurricane, waves swept across the entire reservation for hours. Fanny would later tell Thomas how the water was actually coming up between the floorboards of the house as the waves rumbled over the land. Now, 1928 was no better when it came to hurricane damage to the station and area in general. Sand had piled up across the reservation, again, along with vegetation debris. Again, it would take months and months to return the station to normal. Again, it was a constant recurring theme for about 3 years there. Everything had been affected by the storms, and the Knights took these photos, but we're not really sure if the car that is displayed here was theirs or not, but definitely show what the power of a hurricane can do in the area. One night shell we know, unfortunately, next to nothing about was Dick. We do know that he had his own boat, as you can see pictured here. He would get married, divorced, and live in Fort Pierce for the remainder of his life. After Mary was widowed, she would move there too, as his health was failing and needed her assistance. However, well before this, Mary was a happy, fun-loving daughter who easily made a lot of friends in the area. In 1929, Mary would need medical attention, going to Good Samaritan Hospital in Palm Beach for an appendicitis. Ironically, the second assistant, David Swain, pictured here with his daughter Jackie, would go to the Marine Hospital in Key West for the exact same malady. And how would you like to have all your medical stuff published in the newspaper? So Mary's surgery was a success and life returned to normal. And just as people loved coming to the lighthouse to visit, well, she, Burnham, and Minnie went off to see more of Florida. Well, they traveled to Key West, to Palm Beach, to Daytona, and one day they even bumped into the little tramp, Charlie Chaplin. On July 17, 1937, she would marry a local charter fisherman named Fred Voss Jr., who piloted the Lucky Lady. Voss descended from the Pierce family, and Charles Pierce for a time was even one of the Barefoot Mailmen. Mary would have 2 children, Marcia and Sheldon. Sheldon would later be a co-owner of the Musicians Exchange in Pompano. Mary, Mary, like many Lighthouse ladies, would find work at the Hillsborough Club, and then later at the Wahoo Lodge. Hurricanes didn't stop coming, boats didn't stop wrecking, and technology didn't stop progressing. When the lighthouse was electrified in 1932, the second assistant position was eliminated the following year, leaving more work for Knight and Eisler. Fanny's health continued to deteriorate, though, to the point where in 1935 she had to go to Miami for care. Sadly, she passed away in the hospital on May 31st. Believe it or not, she was only 56. Now, I saw somewhere, but I can't find confirmation that at the time businesses in Pompano would shut down for funerals out of respect, and being a small community, most of the people would want to attend the funeral of a friend. So if anybody can confirm this, please let me know, because I really want to have this be confirmed. After she passed away, unfortunately, Thomas's own health continued to erode as well. Now, I believe his issues revolved around the fact that at least twice a year, he had to drain and clean the mercury from the lens trough, straining it through a cheesecloth type material to remove debris. Also, he had to scrape and paint the lighthouse nearly every year with a red lead-based coat, a lead-based covering coat. In order to do so, he had to climb ladders and use planking in order to have a place to stand on. If he didn't do that, he had to hang off the top in a bosun chair in order to reach everything. Now think about how sloppy you are with your paint. Now imagine doing that with lead paint. Plus, don't forget the roof of the lighthouse needed to be painted too. The interior walls of the lighthouse and even the stairs were painted roughly every 3 years. The cottages received the same, the storehouses received the same, just not as often. Even their cisterns that held their fresh water had to be cleaned and given a coat of lead-based sealant. And all this was done without any type of protective equipment, so all that was touching his skin all the time. By 1935, an additional keeper had to be sent to do more dangerous external painting, as Knight and Eisler just couldn't perform the task anymore. In 1936, Thomas pretty much knew his time was up. So he went to see Dr. Elliot Hendricks, the same doctor who had to patch and then later pronounced dead the rum runner hung at BMR, documented in the book, Hanging BMR, if you're interested. When Knight came to his appointment, he was a shell of a man that he used to be. According to the exam, Knight stood 5'9", was 184 pounds, had failing eyesight, had all teeth extracted, had chronic pharyngitis, slight sclerosis of the blood vessels, had a right-sided facial droop, a slight sway with standing, very sluggish reflexes, and a coarse tremor on his right side with partial paresis. Now, because of the tremor, beginning in 1935, Mary had helped him write the daily log as it worsened. He would dictate the words as Mary wrote the events of the day. Now, if the district inspector wanted to, he could have made a lot of trouble, but Thomas had a perfect record and it earned his respect, so fortunately, nothing ever happened. Now, over the previous 9 years, Thomas had been hospitalized for varicose veins, myocarditis, gallbladder disease, and a painful spine. Now, just think about all the rescues. I didn't even touch on all of them. The late hours, the long days, and all the work involved in keeping the station in excellent working order, and the condition that he was doing it in. Thomas Knight was truly dedicated to his profession and earned every commendation ever awarded to him. Thomas retired on December 31st, 1936. He moved to a small house in Pompano, but sadly, his retirement was not very long. Just over a year later, he would pass away on February 8th, 1938. Believe it or not, he was only 59. Cap had the most longevity of the family, passing away in 1964 at age 93. In 1965 was a really bad year for the family, as Mary's husband Fred and brother Ellis both passed away a week apart in March. Fred was 54, Ellis was 59. If that wasn't bad enough, they were then followed by Burnham in August, the day before his 62nd birthday. Minnie would pass away in 1976, and Mary survived until 1982. Well, the pioneers may be gone, but we'll make sure that their legacy definitely lives on. Thank you.